everyone, welcome to our video on patterns of population change, part 2. In this video, we're going to talk about natural selection and reproductive isolation. Let's get into it. Natural selection, as what we've talked about from our theory of evolution so far, basically says that the individuals who are going to reproduce and survive and pass their genes on are the ones who are best adapted for survival and reproduction. So, for example, in this case, the crows really like to eat green beetles. So it's actually an advantage. The ones who are best adapted for survival are the orange ones because the green ones are getting eaten. And basically what's going to end up happening is that orange ones are going to be able to survive better and therefore be able to reproduce better. And over a long period of time, the population is going to change to be mostly orange beetles because of the pressure of the crows eating green beetles. So the ones who are best adapted for survival and reproduction are going to be the ones who survive and reproduce. There are four main types. There are stabilizing selection, directional selection, disruptive selection, and sexual selection. Let's break those down. So stabilizing selection basically means that for any given trait, the middle trait, if there's kind of a spectrum of those traits, the middle one is going to be those who are best adapted for survival, and it's going to eliminate individuals who are on one end or the other of the spectrum. Robins laying eggs is an example of this because it's typical for robins to lay 4 eggs, sometimes 3, sometimes 5, but usually 4 eggs. And the reason for that is that having too few of eggs, like having only 1 or 2 eggs, tended to be bad because sometimes the chicks just didn't survive. Sometimes they were hunted by predators. And having really large nests of eggs was also really bad because then the parents didn't have the resources to be able to feed their chicks. And so those populations tended to die off, whether they were too few eggs or too many eggs. And so that middle number of eggs of about 4 eggs tended to be best. And that must have been genetic, how a robin would end up producing and laying 4 eggs. So over time, since the nests that had 4 eggs in them tended to do the best, that gene for having 4 eggs got passed on more in the population, and that group ended up being selected. That's stabilizing selection because it's that trait that's right in the middle, having 4 eggs, not 1 or 2, not 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, but having 4 eggs was selected. Another type of selection is directional, and that's when the population actually shifts towards just one direction or the other, not right up in the middle. This happened with the peppered moths during the Industrial Revolution. Originally, they were speckled and had white and black spots, but it became an advantage to be mostly black because those moths wanted to blend in with the soot on buildings and trees. And so the entire population, because it was an advantage to be darker colored, shifted to the right to be a darker colored moth. And because that went just in one direction, we call it directional selection. Basically, it's that extreme version of a trait that makes the organism more fit to survive and reproduce. The last type that's typically shown in a chart like this is disruptive selection, and that basically splits a population into 2 groups on either extreme. So in this population, gray and Himalayan, which is both gray and white, rabbits are better adapted to blend in with the rocks in their environments, while white rabbits were not. So in this population, where there might have originally been mostly white rabbits, the ones who tended to be gray survive better, or the ones who tended to be gray and white survive better, but the plain white ones didn't survive as well. So the population split to where you have more gray ones and you have more white and black ones, but not so many plain white ones. And since that split in 2 directions, it kind of disrupted in the middle. That's called disruptive selection. That's also happened with these snake species in certain forest populations. There are gray rocks and brown rocks. And so the snake population has split into gray snakes and brown snakes, not some original middle like black snake, because the gray snakes could blend in well with the gray stone and the brown snakes could blend in well with the brown stone. And so that population has split in one direction or another. And since it's gone in those opposite directions, that could end up actually branching off into being 2 separate species, but it hasn't gotten there yet. The summary is here, and you can kind of put it together. So in this original population, there are mice of all different colors, and due to different pressures, they might have changed one way or another. If it was stabilizing selection, that means that the middle shade of gray mouse was best adapted to survive, and so therefore there would be less white mice and less black mice, and that would be stabilizing selection. Directional selection would have been if it was a benefit to either be white or to be black, but in this case, to just be black. And so that overall population would shift towards being black mice rather than gray or white. It would move in one direction. That's directional selection. Disruptive selection would mean that it is an advantage to be white, but it is also an advantage to be black, and it is not an advantage to be gray. And so that population would split. It would be disrupted. It would be disruptive selection, where you would end up with mice who are white and mice who are black, but not so many who are gray. Now, the next type of selection is not typically shown on a graph, but it is sexual selection, and it's worth mentioning. This is based on the ability to attract a mate, either being large or beautifully colored, or maybe being threatening to other males, like a moose with large antlers. And what it results in a lot of times is males and females of the same species looking very different. So in moose population, the males have big horns that they use to show that they're the best mate, and the females don't have horns at all. And so the males and females look different, but the females are almost always going to select the males with the biggest, best antlers. Same in the peacock population. The male is going to be selected if he has big, bright feathers. And the female doesn't need to have big, bright feathers. She's the one doing the selecting. She's going to stay plain and brown to hide from predators, but the male who's going to be selected is going to be the one with big, bright feathers. And so, over many, many, many generations, the male peacocks are going to tend to get even bigger and even brighter feathers because that's favored for sexual selection. All right, we've talked about some different ways how populations can change, but we're going to talk now about some blocks against animals and other organisms, even actually mating and being able to cause change in their populations. So, reproductive isolation is ways when gene flow or immigration and immigration are prevented among populations. There's two types, prezygotic and postzygotic. Prezygotic means it happens before fertilization. One of the biggest, most important difference there is going to be geographic differences. So, geographic differences are going to be things like a certain species of bird who lives on the West Coast, and that same species of bird who lives on the East Coast are actually not necessarily going to mate because they live on opposite sides of the country. They're not going to come in contact with each other that likely. So that's a prezygotic barrier to them mating. A bird that lives in California is pretty much not going to mate with a bird that lives in Virginia because they are separated geographically. This can also be due to ecological differences and even behavioral differences, such as a bird's song. So, two birds who actually look pretty much alike, like you see in the picture here, they might have two different songs. And so, this bird's only going to mate with birds who have its same song, and this bird's only going to mate with ones that have its same song, and they wouldn't mate with each other because even though they look alike and they're from the same species, they don't have the same song. And so that's before fertilization would even occur, they're not going to get together due to the difference in their songs. That's prezygotic reproductive isolation if it occurs before fertilization might happen. Postzygotic reproductive isolation would occur after fertilization has occurred. And basically, this is the case of hybrids. So you might have heard of a mule, and you might have heard that mules are infertile. They're not actually able to reproduce to make viable offspring. Mule is the result of a horse and a donkey mating. And horses and donkeys can mate. There is no prezygotic or postzygotic isolation between horses and donkeys, even though they are two separate species. They are able to mate, and then the product of that, a mule, is infertile, and the mule cannot mate together with another mule to make any more mules. And so, for that reason, the only way to get a mule is to mate a horse and a donkey. You can't get a mule from other mules. And that's the reason why horses and donkeys and mules are all actually considered different species, is because the hybrid cannot develop to reproduce on its own. Thank you so much for listening.